On the island of Attu in May of 1943, American forces buried 2,351 Japanese soldiers in mass graves, the end result of a garrison of roughly 2,500 to 2,900 men who fought almost to the last soldier. Only 28 were taken prisoner. Not 28% of the garrison, 28 men, out of nearly 3,000. None of those men had grown up believing that surrender was a crime worse than death, and that belief itself is where this story really starts. The idea that a Japanese soldier had to die rather than be captured wasn't an ancient warrior code passed down from the age of the samurai. It was a modern invention built deliberately across just a few decades by writers, bureaucrats, and a war ministry that needed an army willing to disappear rather than yield ground. What follows is the story of how that invention got built, how it got enforced, and why the men who actually fought under it didn't all obey it the same way. The word most people reach for is Bushido, the way of the warrior. Popular history treats it as a continuous thread running from medieval samurai battlefields straight through to the caves of Iwo Jima, an unbroken code of honor that made Japanese soldiers uniquely willing to die rather than yield. That version of the story falls apart under scholarly scrutiny, and the historian who has done the most to take it apart is Oleg Benish, whose 2014 book Inventing the Way of the Samurai remains the standard academic account of the subject. Benish's argument is direct, and it's backed by researchers including Carl Friday, G. Cameron Hurst, and Thomas Conlon. No unified warrior ideology called Bushido existed in pre-modern Japan. The term barely shows up in historical writing before the 20th century. Conlon's research on medieval samurai found that loyalty and honor in that era were frequently self-interested rather than idealistic. Soldiers switched allegiances, negotiated their own surrenders, and preserved their own lives whenever the political winds shifted, in ways that looked nothing like the death before dishonor absolutism later attributed to them. What later generations called Bushido was, in Benish's framing, a search for national identity built during Japan's rapid modernization in the late 1800s, and it borrowed heavily from a source that surprises most people, European chivalry. To see how recent that construction really was, it helps to place it against the actual timeline of Japanese history rather than the vague, timeless past most popular accounts imply. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 formally abolished the samurai as a distinct legal class within a few years of taking power, which means the modern idea of Bushido wasn't a code the samurai themselves left behind. It was assembled roughly a generation after the samurai had already ceased to exist as a social class with any legal privileges. Two foundational documents came before Bushido even entered common use. The 1882 Imperial Rescript to Soldiers and Sailors, which bound military personnel directly to the emperor, and the 1890 Imperial Rescript on Education, which extended that same loyalty framework into every Japanese schoolroom. When Bushido arrived roughly a decade later, it didn't create the loyalty to emperor structure from nothing. It gave an already existing state loyalty program a name that sounded ancient. Understanding that Bushido was built, not inherited, changes the entire question worth asking here. If the soldiers who fought and died on Attu, Saipan, Poliliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa weren't channeling 1,000 years of continuous warrior tradition, then something else explains why so few of them surrendered, and that something else has two parts. One is an ideology that was manufactured and then weaponized by the Japanese state. The other is a set of battlefield realities that made surrender genuinely dangerous no matter what any individual soldier personally believed. Both parts matter here, because among the historians who study this question professionally, the argument over which one matters more is still unresolved. What follows moves roughly in the order the ideology itself developed, from the invention of the idea, through its conversion into military law, into the battlefield statistics that show its effect, into the historiographical argument over what actually explains those statistics, and finally into what the ideology cost the individual human beings who lived and died inside it. The single most influential document in the popular imagination of Bushido was written not for Japanese readers, but for Americans and Europeans. Inatso Naitobe, a Quaker-educated diplomat and agricultural economist, completed Bushido, the Soul of Japan around 1899, publishing it in English first. Naitobe wanted to explain Japanese ethics to a Western audience that assumed Japan had no coherent moral philosophy of its own, and his method was to map Japanese virtue directly onto concepts Westerners already understood: rectitude, courage, benevolence, politeness, sincerity, honor, and loyalty. The book reads less like an ethnography of an existing culture and more like a translation exercise, taking Victorian gentlemanly ideals and dressing them in a kimono. There's a modern parallel worth sitting with here. Naitobe was doing something close to what a nation-brand consultant does today when a country needs to project a coherent identity abroad, distilling something inconsistent and locally contested into a clean, exportable narrative. Naitobe's Bushido sold Japan to the West as a nation of Christian-adjacent gentleman warriors, at a moment when Japan badly wanted to be recognized as a civilized peer power rather than a target for colonization, and the strategy worked. The book went through 10 editions by 1905, and it wasn't even translated into Japanese until 1908, which means the first Japanese readers of the modern, codified version of their own supposed warrior tradition encountered it years after Western readers already had. Naitobe himself went on to a long international career after the book made him famous. He later served as an Undersecretary General of the League of Nations, and his portrait appears on Japan's 5,000 yen banknote today, a level of official commemoration that says a great deal about how completely his version of Japanese identity got absorbed into the national self-image, regardless of how recently it had actually been constructed. Naitobe wasn't the sole architect of the idea either, and according to Benish's research, he may not even have been the most consequential one. Scholar-bureaucrat Inoue Tetsujiro pushed a harder, more militarized version of Bushido aimed at domestic Japanese audiences rather than Western ones, explicitly framing it against what he dismissed as the mere woman worship of European chivalry. Journalist and politician Ozaki Yukio had been developing the modern discourse around the term nearly a decade before Naitobe's book ever appeared in print. Bushido, in other words, was never one book by one author. It was a set of competing, evolving projects, assembled by different people for different audiences, and later generations flattened all of it into a single, ancient-sounding tradition. The most striking evidence that Bushido was recognized as an invention even at the time it was being invented comes from a contemporary Western scholar, not a later revisionist historian working with the benefit of hindsight. Basil Hall Chamberlain, a British-born professor who had lived and worked in Japan for decades, published an essay in 1912 titled The Invention of a New Religion. Chamberlain stated plainly that the term barely existed in dictionaries before 1900, and he went further than that, writing that Bushido, as an institution or a code of rules, had never actually existed, and that the accounts given of it had been fabricated out of whole cloth, chiefly for foreign consumption. That's an extraordinary claim for a contemporary observer to make in 1912, more than 3 decades before any of the battles covered here were ever fought. The invention was visible to at least one clear-eyed outsider while it was still in progress, and it didn't take modern academics to spot it in hindsight. Chamberlain's essay sat largely forgotten for most of the 20th century, overshadowed by the very mythology it had tried to puncture. It took Benish's full-length academic treatment nearly 100 years later to build the same argument into a full, peer-reviewed history, drawing on a far wider base of primary sources than Chamberlain ever had access to in 1912. Historian Konstantin Vaporis, reviewing Benish's work for the American Historical Review in 2016, affirmed the book's central finding, noting that the search for a coherent national identity during modernization, not any inherited warrior tradition, was what actually produced the Bushido most people now take for granted as ancient. An invented tradition stays harmless as long as it stays a book on a shelf. Bushido stopped being harmless the moment the Imperial Japanese Army began writing it into military law, and that shift happened gradually, then all at once. As early as 1908, The Army's criminal code already punished a commander who surrendered without fighting to the last man with death, which shows the military moving towards zero tolerance for surrender well before the Pacific War even began. Japan hadn't always behaved this way, and that point deserves to be stated clearly. During the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, and again during the First World War, Japan generally treated enemy prisoners according to international norms, and its own captured soldiers weren't automatically branded dishonored. The hardening came later, deliberately, from the top of the military hierarchy down. That gap between Japan's correct treatment of prisoners in 1904 and 1918 and the absolute doctrine that followed by 1941 is worth pausing on, because it undercuts any claim that this was simply how Japan had always fought its wars. Something changed in the intervening decades, the same decades in which Inoue Tetsujiro's more militarized version of Bushido was steadily displacing Naito's gentler, internationally minded one, and in which the broader Japanese state was shifting from a constitutional monarchy with real civilian political influence toward the military-dominated government that would eventually take the country to war across Asia and the Pacific. The no-surrender doctrine didn't emerge in isolation, it emerged alongside, and as part of, that larger political transformation. The document that finalized the transformation was the Senjinkan, the Field Service Code, issued on January 8 of 1941, under Army Order No. 1, in the name of War Minister Hideki Tojo. Coming 11 months before Pearl Harbor, the Senjinkan was distributed to every soldier in the Imperial Army as an official statement of expected conduct in the field, and it arrived with its own promotional campaign, including a song of the Senjinkan written to spread its message beyond the printed text. The Senjinkan's most infamous passage, in the Tokyo Gazette's own 1941 English translation, instructed soldiers this way: "If alive, do not suffer the disgrace of becoming a prisoner, and in death, do not leave behind a name soiled by misdeeds." A widely cited modern rendering from historian Ulrich Strauss puts it even more bluntly: never live to experience shame as a prisoner, because dying spares you from leaving behind the crime of a stain on your honor. There's a translation nuance here that most retellings of this story skip entirely, and it matters for accuracy. Translator Hiroaki Sato has pointed out that the literal Japanese text of that passage is a two-part parallel construction that doesn't, in the strictest grammatical sense, command suicide over capture. It more precisely instructs soldiers to do their utmost not to be taken captive at all. The document is known today, in Sato's words, virtually for that command alone, and the practical effect on the ground was understood by soldiers as a death before capture order regardless of what the underlying grammar technically allowed. The honest version of this story acknowledges that the most quoted line in Japanese military history is slightly softer in its original text than its popular reputation suggests, even though its real-world consequences weren't soft in the slightest. There's a bitter irony buried in the same document too. The Senjinkan also instructed soldiers to show mercy toward enemies who surrendered to them, a standard the Imperial Army didn't consistently apply to the Allied prisoners who fell into its own hands, a separate and well-documented chapter of the war that sits outside what's being covered here, but it's worth acknowledging it exists. A document capable of demanding infinite sacrifice from its own soldiers, while simultaneously instructing mercy toward the enemy. Mercy its own institution wouldn't reliably extend, was never a coherent ethical system in the first place. It was a wartime instrument, written to produce a specific battlefield behavior, and the moral consistency of its individual clauses was never really the point. In 1942, the Army tightened the policy further, amending its disciplinary code to impose a minimum 6 months of imprisonment on any soldier taken prisoner, regardless of the circumstances of his capture. It didn't matter whether a man was unconscious, wounded beyond any ability to resist, or captured through no failure of judgment on his part. The system was built to treat the simple fact of capture as evidence of guilt. Put the 1908 Criminal Code, the 1941 Senjinkan, and the 1942 Amendment together, and you get a 14-year progression. each step narrowing the space in which a Japanese soldier could survive capture without facing formal consequence, whether he lived to face them or not. By the time the Pacific War's major island battles began, that progression had already closed almost entirely. A soldier entering combat in 1943 was operating under a legal and cultural framework that had spent more than 3 decades tightening around exactly the choice he might one day have to make. One popular claim about this subject needs correcting directly before going further because it circulates constantly in documentaries and online summaries, and it simply isn't true. The idea that the Japanese language had no word for surrender doesn't hold up. Kozen and kafuku both mean surrender, and both were in ordinary use, so the words themselves were never missing. What was missing was any tolerance for saying them, since the real issue was the unbearable shame the Senjinkan and the broader Bushido revival had attached to that vocabulary. A word that exists but that no soldier can bring himself to say, or bear to hear said about himself, produces the same battlefield outcome as a missing word, but the underlying mechanism is entirely different, and the difference matters, because it locates the problem in ideology and enforcement rather than in language itself. There's a legal detail worth adding alongside that correction. Japan signed the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War, but its government never ratified it, which meant Japan was never formally bound by the treaty's protections during the Pacific War on either side of the equation, not for prisoners it held, and not for its own soldiers who fell into Allied hands. The Senjinkan's death before capture doctrine got drafted into that legal vacuum, not in defiance of a treaty Japan had fully committed to honoring. The battlefield record shows the Senjinkan's real-world effect almost immediately, and one contemporary comparison puts the scale of it into perspective. Neil Ferguson's research on prisoner-taking across the Second World War found a rough ordering of which nationalities were most willing to surrender under pressure. Italian forces surrendered most readily, German forces next, and Japanese forces least of all, a hierarchy that lines up closely with how deeply and how recently each nation's military culture had built formal anti-surrender doctrine into its training. Italy's military culture carried no equivalent of the Senjinkan and no comparable post-war disgrace attached to capture. Germany's Wehrmacht operated under real disciplinary pressure against surrender, particularly later in the war, but nothing that criminalized the mere fact of being captured the way Japan's 1942 disciplinary amendment did. Japan sat at the extreme end of that scale not by accident, but because its doctrine on the subject was, among the major combatants of the Second World War, uniquely absolute. Ferguson's broader wartime figure for the ratio of Japanese soldiers captured to Japanese soldiers killed across the entire Pacific War worked out to roughly 1 to 40, meaning for every 40 Japanese soldiers who died in combat, on average only 1 was taken alive. That average conceals enormous variation depending on theater and year, which is exactly what the individual battles ahead demonstrate. No other major army in the Second World War, on any front, produced a comparable ratio across a comparably long span of sustained fighting. And that's part of why this subject still draws serious academic attention more than 80 years later. Not because the raw brutality of the Pacific War was unique in human history, but because the specific mechanism producing that brutality, a modern legal and ideological system dressed up as an ancient warrior code, is unusually well documented and unusually traceable back to its actual origins. At the Battle of Guadalcanal, fought from August of 1942 to February of 1943, the National World War II Museum records that Imperial Japan lost roughly 14,800 men killed in action and another 9,000 to disease, against roughly 1,000 captured, already a dramatically lopsided ratio compared to European theaters of the same war. The overall scale of Japanese captivity across the entire Pacific War is itself a contested figure, and it's worth presenting as a range rather than a single confident number, since different researchers working from different archives arrive at different totals. Ulrich Strauss's figure of roughly 35,000 prisoners taken by Western Allied and Chinese forces between December of 1941 and August of 1945 is the most commonly cited baseline. Japan's own wartime prisoner of war information bureau recorded 42,543. Other researchers, including Hadi's 1996 study, pushed the range as high as 50,000. While a detailed regional count from historian Robert Gilmore found at least 19,500 prisoners taken in the Southwest Pacific Theater alone, broken down year by year. Just 1,167 in 1942, 1,064 in 1943, 5,122 in 1944, and 12,194 in 1945. That curve on its own shows how completely the trajectory of captures tracked the collapsing military situation in the war's final year, not any change in ideology. The most extreme version of this ratio shows up not on a Pacific island at all, but in the Burma campaign, where roughly 1,700 Japanese soldiers were captured against roughly 150,000 killed, and of that small number of prisoners, only about 400 were even physically fit for questioning. Every one of the remaining captured men attempted suicide within their first week in Allied custody, a detail that shows the ideology operating even after capture had already technically happened, as though surrender weren't a single moment a soldier could survive, but a status he was still expected to undo. The pattern intensified on At-2 the following spring. The Aleutian garrison of roughly 2,500 to 2,900 men, commanded by Colonel Yasuo Yamasaki, who was killed leading the final banzai charge himself, ended with 2,351 Japanese dead buried by American forces and only 28 taken prisoner. American losses were severe too, 549 killed in action, roughly 1,148 wounded, and more than 1,200 additional casualties from exposure and weather, making At-2 proportionally the second costliest American battle of the entire Pacific War after Iwo Jima. By the summer of 1944, the pattern had scaled up to an entire island's civilian population, not just its garrison. At the Battle of Saipan, fought from June 15th to July 9th, roughly 30,000 Japanese military personnel were killed. On July 7th, an estimated 4,000 of them died in a single mass assault, the largest banzai charge of the entire war. Roughly 1,700 prisoners were taken during the campaign, and about half of them were Korean laborers rather than ethnic Japanese combat troops, a detail worth holding on to for later. Civilian deaths on Saipan ran between roughly 8,000 and 10,000, close to 40% of the island's civilian population, as families, following the same cultural logic that governed the military, chose mass suicide over capture by American forces. Commanders Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito and Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo were both among the dead. This is the point in the story where the ideology traced back to a 1899 book stopped being something that shaped only soldiers and became something that shaped entire civilian communities. The Senjinkan was a military document, written for men in uniform, but the cultural logic underneath it, that capture meant a fate worse than death, and that dying was a way of protecting family honor rather than abandoning family, had by 1944 spread well beyond the barracks and into how ordinary Japanese civilians, including parents with young children, understood their own choices in the face of an approaching enemy. The scale of the fighting on Saipan directly shaped how American planners thought about the rest of the war. A Joint Chiefs of Staff planning document from August of 1944, sometimes called the Saipan Ratio, projected that roughly 1 American would be killed and several more wounded for every 7 Japanese killed in future island assaults, a projection that later fed directly into the invasion casualty estimates American planners used when contemplating an assault on the Japanese home islands themselves. At Peleliu, fought from September to November of 1944, a garrison of roughly 11,000 men under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa produced just 202 prisoners across the entire campaign. And of those 202, only 19 were actually Japanese soldiers. The rest were Korean and Okinawan laborers, conscripted colonial subjects rather than ethnic Japanese combat troops raised inside the full ideological system traced so far. Colonel Nakagawa himself took his own life rather than surrender. 19 out of 202. That single statistic is one of the clearest pieces of evidence in the entire historical record that the no-surrender behavior tracked much more closely with ideological indoctrination and national identity than with anything universal about the Japanese military as an institution. Set that number against the garrison size, and the arithmetic gets even starker. Roughly 11,000 men defended Polilliu, and if the no-surrender behavior really were an inherent, unbreakable trait shared equally by every man wearing an Imperial Japanese uniform, there's no obvious reason ethnic background should predict who lived to be captured and who didn't. Instead, the Korean and Okinawan laborers serving alongside Nakagawa's soldiers surrendered at a rate that dwarfed the rate among the ethnic Japanese troops fighting beside them, in the same defensive positions, under the same hopeless circumstances, facing the same American assault. Circumstance was identical, but ideology wasn't, and the outcome split along exactly the line you'd predict if ideology, rather than pure survival instinct, were doing most of the work. Iwo Jima, fought from February 19 to March 26 of 1945, remains the starkest single data point most people already associate with this subject. Out of a garrison of roughly 21,000 to 20,000 men under Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, only 216 prisoners were taken during the entire battle, and some of those were captured only because they were unconscious or too disabled to resist. Historian Robert Burrell has revised the Japanese death toll downward since the war to somewhere between 18,060 and 18,600, correcting earlier estimates that ran as high as 25,000. Kurabayashi's command style is itself a useful correction to the idea that every Japanese commander in this war was simply executing blind doctrine without independent judgment. He had lived and traveled in the United States before the war, understood American industrial capacity better than most of his peers, and had genuinely argued against the decision to go to war with Washington in the first place. Once ordered to defend Iwo Jima, though, he applied that same clear-eyed judgment to building the most effective defensive position American forces encountered anywhere in the Pacific, an underground network designed not to win the battle outright, but to inflict maximum, prolonged cost on the invading force, which is precisely what happened. Iwo Jima remains the only major amphibious battle of the Pacific War in which total American casualties, 6,821 killed and more than 19,000 wounded, exceeded total Japanese losses. Admiral Chester Nimitz's famous assessment of the battle, that among the Americans who fought their uncommon valor was a common virtue, has become one of the most quoted lines of the entire war. An estimated 3,000 Japanese soldiers kept resisting from the island's cave network even after the battle was officially declared over, a delayed tale of resistance that shows how loosely defined the actual end of a Pacific Island battle could be for the men still inside it, long after the flags had gone up and the official casualty counts had been filed. Every battle covered so far follows the same brutal arithmetic. Okinawa doesn't, and the way it breaks the pattern is the single most important data point in this entire story. The Battle of Okinawa, fought from April 1st to June 22nd of 1945, was the largest and bloodiest of the Pacific Island campaigns. Japanese military deaths may have exceeded 100,000, and civilian deaths ran somewhere between 94,000 and over 100,000, potentially a quarter to a third of the island's entire pre-war population. American casualties topped 45,000, including roughly 12,500 killed, and General Mitsuru Ushijima, the Japanese commander, took his own life as the battle ended. By every measure of scale and horror, Okinawa was worse than anything that came before it here. And yet, over the course of that campaign, roughly 11,250 Japanese military personnel surrendered, including 3,581 unarmed laborers, approximately 12% of the defending force. 12% doesn't sound dramatic in isolation, until you set it against Iwo Jima's roughly 1% or Attu's roughly 1%. Something changed at Okinawa, and it wasn't the ideology. The Shinjinkan hadn't been repealed, and the disciplinary code hadn't softened. What changed was the composition of the defending force itself. A large share of the Okinawa garrison consisted of recently conscripted Home Guard troops, the Beitai, men who had spent far less time inside the military's indoctrination pipeline than the long-serving career soldiers who held Attu or Iwo Jima to nearly the last man. If Bushido as pure ideology were the entire explanation, indoctrination intensity shouldn't matter at all. A Japanese soldier would simply be a Japanese soldier, regardless of how long he'd served or how recently he'd been conscripted. But it clearly did matter, and that single fact is the strongest evidence in the entire record for the argument that comes next. There's a second factor worth naming alongside the composition of the garrison. By the spring of 1945, Japan's home islands were themselves under sustained bombing. Its shipping routes were being strangled, and its remaining forces on Okinawa were fighting with no realistic prospect of resupply or reinforcement of any kind. A soldier's calculation about whether resistance still served any purpose was different on Okinawa in June of 1945 than it had been on Attu in May of 1943, when the war's outcome still felt genuinely undecided to the men fighting it. Structural collapse and ideological baseline were both operating on the same battlefield at the same time, and that's exactly why the Okinawa numbers resist being explained by either factor alone. There's a real, ongoing argument among historians about why Japanese soldiers so rarely surrendered, and nobody should pretend it's been settled, because among the people who study it professionally, it hasn't. One camp treats ideology as the primary driver of the behavior. Historian Saburo Ienaga, who also spent decades fighting the Japanese Ministry of Education in court over its censorship of wartime history in school textbooks, argued in his book The Pacific War that emperor worship, militarist indoctrination, and brutal internal army discipline together made death genuinely preferable to the shame of capture for most soldiers. Historian Yuki Tanaka, in Hidden Horrors, traces a documented shift within the Imperial Army itself from a relatively compassionate approach toward enemy prisoners earlier in the 20th century toward a death-before-capture culture that Tanaka argues emerged specifically from the militarization of emperor ideology, describing it as a transformation of the old warrior tradition into what he calls a dangerous cult of emperor worship, rather than any continuous inheritance from the samurai era. Ulrich Strauss goes a step further, calling the no-surrender policy a catastrophic waste and a colossal military blunder, since the Imperial Army, as Strauss points out, never trained its own soldiers in what to do if capture happened anyway, because official doctrine refused to acknowledge that possibility could legitimately exist. Strauss's research carries real weight here because it draws directly on post-war interviews and archival records of roughly 35,000 documented prisoners, giving the ideological argument a concrete evidentiary base rather than resting on the Shinjinkan's text alone. His conclusion isn't that Japanese soldiers were incapable of rational calculation. It's that the calculation available to them had been deliberately narrowed by their own government to a single acceptable outcome, with every alternative defined in advance as dishonorable regardless of circumstance. The opposing camp treats situational and structural pressure as doing most of the real work, and its strongest argument comes from historian John Dower. In War Without Mercy, Dower reframes the entire question. Surrender in the Pacific War often wasn't just shameful within Japanese culture, it was physically lethal, and that had almost nothing to do with Japanese ideology and everything to do with how Allied forces treated men who tried to surrender. Neil Ferguson's research backs this up directly, arguing that the belief Allied troops would simply kill a man on the spot regardless of any gesture of surrender was a more powerful discouragement than fear of formal discipline or personal dishonor. The wartime timeline supports the structural argument as well. If pure ideology explained the behavior on its own, surrender rates should have stayed roughly flat for the whole war, since the Shinjinkan's provisions never changed. Instead, The ratio of Japanese prisoners to Japanese dead climbed from roughly 1 in 100 in late 1944 to roughly 1 in 7 by July of 1945, a shift that tracks almost exactly with improving Allied surrender encouragement efforts and worsening Japanese supply conditions, not with any softening of official doctrine, which never wavered at all. A third strand of research, from military sociologist Hitoshi Kawano, sidesteps the ideology question almost entirely. Kawano's case studies of specific Japanese units, including the 37th Division in China and forces at Guadalcanal, argue that Japanese combat behavior, whether a unit fought to annihilation or, in some documented cases, chose to surrender, is best explained by primary group cohesion and the quality of small unit leadership. The same sociological framework researchers have long used to explain American and German combat morale, rather than by national ideology on its own. Kawano's Japanese-language book on the subject, whose title translates roughly to An Army of Death Before Dishonour, an army that returns home, directly contrasts units that destroyed themselves with units that came home intact, and locates the difference in organizational and situational variables rather than in any fixed cultural trait. In his research on Guadalcanal, Kawano even concludes that combat leadership principles were almost identical between Japanese and American tactical leaders, with only slight cultural differences separating them, a striking claim given how differently the two armies usually get portrayed. Kawano documents individual cases that undercut the pure ideology narrative directly too, including one prisoner from the 37th Division whose stated reason for surrendering had nothing to do with rejecting Bushido at all. He said simply that he wanted to come home early because his mother was waiting for him. That single line, recorded decades after the fact in an academic case study rather than in any wartime propaganda leaflet, does more to complicate the fanatic stereotype than almost any statistic here, precisely because it's so ordinary. It isn't the statement of a man rejecting an ideology through some act of moral courage. It's the statement of a tired, frightened soldier whose reasoning, stripped of the national mythology built up around him, turns out to look very much like anyone else's. None of these historians describe a fictional army of fanatics with no interior life. What they describe is closer to what organizational psychologists call a high coercion culture, a system where the stated rules are extreme, enforcement is inconsistent in practice, and individual behavior ends up shaped as much by unit-level pressure and physical circumstance as by the rules written on paper. That framework, borrowed from a completely different field of study, fits the Pacific War evidence better than either a pure ideology story or a pure circumstance story fits on its own. It's worth being explicit about where this leaves the argument, rather than pretending a tidy answer exists. The evidence assembled here doesn't support throwing out the ideological explanation. The Senjinkan was real, it was enforced, and it produced a battlefield culture measurably more extreme than any other major combatant army fielded in the Second World War, Axis, or Allied. But it also doesn't support treating ideology as sufficient on its own, because ideology alone can't explain why the same official doctrine produced a 1% surrender rate in one garrison and a 12% surrender rate in another, or why colonial subject laborers surrendered at consistently higher rates than ethnic Japanese soldiers serving beside them. The most defensible position treats ideology as the force that set an extreme baseline for the entire Imperial Army, and treats indoctrination intensity, unit cohesion, leadership quality, the physical possibility of surrendering at all, and the expected treatment from Allied forces as the variables that explain who actually deviated from that baseline and when. This next part is the piece of the story that popular history tends to sand down, and a serious account of the topic can't skip it. John Dower's research documents a pattern of racialized dehumanization running in both directions during the Pacific War. American slogans, like Admiral Halsey's public call to kill Japanese soldiers, circulated widely through the ranks. A 1943 secret American intelligence report, cited by Ferguson, noted that only the promise of ice cream and 3 days of leave could reliably induce American troops not to kill Japanese soldiers who were actively trying to surrender. Historian James Weingartner's research documents the mutilation of Japanese war dead by American troops for souvenirs, including gold teeth taken from corpses, and describes Marines bound for Guadalcanal who openly relished the prospect of making necklaces from them. A 1944 American public opinion poll cited by Dower found that 13% of respondents, when asked what should be done with Japan as a country after the war, answered that all Japanese people should be killed. None of this gets offered to draw a moral equivalence between an army whose written doctrine formally criminalized surrender and individual atrocities committed by opposing soldiers acting outside their own army's rules. It matters because it directly answers a question raised earlier. Why did surrender rates stay so low even as Japan's military position became hopeless? Part of the answer sits entirely outside Japanese ideology. A soldier weighing whether to surrender wasn't only weighing his own culture's judgment of him. He was weighing a real, well-founded fear that the men on the other side of the battlefield might kill him anyway, whatever gesture he made. Dower's broader argument is that this pattern fed itself in both directions at once. Japanese propaganda pointed to Allied brutality as proof that capture meant death, which reinforced the Senjinkan's own message and made soldiers less likely to test whether surrender might actually be survived. Allied propaganda, in turn, dehumanized Japanese soldiers as fundamentally different from European enemies, which made individual American and Australian troops more willing to kill men who were trying to give up. Each side's worst assumptions about the other kept getting confirmed by real events, in a loop that had very little to do with samurai tradition and a great deal to do with how total war, fought across a genuine racial and cultural divide, tends to escalate on its own momentum once it starts. Kazuo Sakamaki became prisoner number one of the Pacific War within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, after the mini-submarine he commanded ran aground. Captured and humiliated by his own culture's standards before the war had even properly begun for most of his countrymen, Sakamaki reportedly begged his American captors to kill him, and they refused. He became a respected figure among fellow prisoners at a camp in Wisconsin, survived the war, and went on to a long post-war career as a Toyota executive. Sakamaki's story illustrates something the Imperial Army's own propaganda never told its soldiers, that the treatment prisoners actually received from American and Australian forces was, in the great majority of documented cases, far better than official Japanese doctrine implied it would be. Because the Army refused to train soldiers in what to do if capture happened, and because its own prisoner of war information bureau, established in December of 1941, deliberately suppressed information about captured men from reaching their families back home. Prisoners frequently adopted false names once caught, assuming, wrongly in most cases, that disgrace and danger awaited them either way. Once in custody, untrained and unprepared for interrogation, many talked freely, and that's precisely why Allied psychological warfare units treated capturing intact, cooperative prisoners as a genuine intelligence opportunity rather than just a battlefield afterthought. The Information Bureau's suppression of prisoner identities deserves its own moment of attention because it closes a loop opened earlier. A soldier's family back in Japan had no reliable way of learning whether a missing son or husband was dead or alive in an Allied camp. The state's own bureaucracy made sure of that. The shame the Senjinkan attached to capture was, for most families, never actually tested against the reality of what had happened to their relative. They were left to assume the worst, which reinforced exactly the cultural terror the ideology depended on, while the men themselves, in many documented cases, were sitting in camps in Wisconsin, Texas, or rural Australia, alive, fed, and increasingly willing to talk. The most vivid documented illustration of this comes from Cowra, in rural New South Wales, Australia. On August 5th of 1944, roughly 1,104 Japanese prisoners of war attempted the largest prison breakout of the Second World War, and the way survivors later described their captivity undercuts the simple narrative that all these men were desperate to escape at any cost. Survivor accounts collected decades later describe the treatment they received from their Australian captors in strikingly warm terms. One former prisoner, Murakami Teruo, called it almost heavenly, while another, Yamada Masayoshi, called it very comfortable, describing conditions fully compliant with the Geneva Convention. The breakout, in that light, wasn't primarily a bid for freedom. It was closer to a mass attempt to reclaim honor through death, since surviving as a known prisoner remained unbearable under the code these men had internalized, regardless of how well they were actually being treated. Estimates placed the Japanese dead at 231 to 234, against 4 Australian soldiers killed. A Japanese fighter pilot named Hajime Toyoshima, the first Japanese man captured on Australian soil, who had been living under a false name, reportedly sounded the bugle that began the breakout before taking his own life. Decades later, the site became a place of genuine reconciliation. Australia ceded land for a Japanese war cemetery in the early 1960s, and a Japanese garden now stands at Cowra as a counterpoint to the violence of that August night. What makes Cowra such a precise case study here is that it isolates the ideology from the circumstance almost perfectly. These men weren't starving, weren't surrounded by hostile jungle, weren't facing an enemy known for killing prisoners on sight. By their own testimony, they were being treated better than the Senjinkan had ever led them to expect any captor would treat them, and several hundred of them still chose to run directly at machine guns and barbed wire, in the middle of the night, with no real prospect of escape from an isolated camp deep inside Australian territory. Because the shame of remaining a known prisoner outweighed every material comfort their captivity actually offered. If the structural explanation for Japanese non-surrender were sufficient on its own, Cowra shouldn't have happened. It happened anyway, and that's exactly why both explanations need to be held at once rather than picking one. There's a detail buried in the battle statistics covered earlier that most retellings of this story skip entirely, and it matters. At Peleliu, only 19 of the 202 total prisoners taken were actually Japanese soldiers. The rest were Korean and Okinawan laborers, colonial subjects conscripted into Imperial Japan's war machine, not volunteers steeped in the ideology traced across this entire story. At Saipan, roughly half of the 1,700 prisoners taken were Korean laborers as well. This matters because the Senjinkan and the broader Bushido revival were explicitly nationalist projects, built to bind ethnic Japanese soldiers to the emperor. Colonial subjects, Koreans, Taiwanese, Okinawans, were pressed into the same army, but were never fully included in the ideological promise that supposedly made death preferable to capture. Their consistently higher relative surrender rates aren't a footnote. They're direct evidence for the structural explanation over the purely ideological one, because the men least indoctrinated into the emperor-centered version of Bushido were consistently the men most likely to survive the war as prisoners rather than casualties. The clearest single illustration of this divide shows up in the post-war holdouts, Japanese soldiers who kept fighting a war that had already ended, in some cases for decades. The most famous case, Hiro Onoda, who held out on Lubang Island in the Philippines until 1974, has been covered in depth elsewhere and isn't the focus here. But Onoda surrendered in the same year as a far less famous soldier whose story reveals exactly how selective Japan's post-war memory of loyalty actually was. Teruo Nakamura, born at Tunpalawan, was an ethnic Amos Taiwanese Aboriginal man serving in the Takasago Volunteer Unit, a colonial regiment. He turned up still holding his position on the island of Morotai on December 18th of 1974, the last confirmed holdout of the entire war. He spoke neither Japanese nor Chinese fluently by the time he was found. When the Japanese government calculated his compensation, it initially offered him roughly 68,000 yen, worth about $227 at the time, a fraction of the far larger pension and public celebration given to Onoda, an ethnic Japanese officer, that same year. Public outcry in Japan eventually forced a larger payment, close to 4.25 million yen, and a 1987 law finally extended proper compensation to surviving Taiwanese veterans and their families more broadly. Nakamura's treatment is a precise, uncomfortable measurement of exactly whose loyalty post-war Japan chose to romanticize and whose loyalty it chose to discount. It's worth sitting with the layers of that story for a moment rather than moving past it quickly. Nakamura fought, by the account of the men who found him, with the same discipline and the same refusal to surrender that Japan spent decades celebrating in its ethnically Japanese holdouts. He did it as a colonial subject, drafted from a Taiwanese Aboriginal community into a war fought in the name of an emperor and a national identity that were never fully his own, under an ideology built, from the very start of this story, to bind ethnic Japanese soldiers specifically to the state. When the war he had never truly stopped fighting finally ended for him in 1974, the nation that had demanded his loyalty for 3 decades initially valued it at $227. Allied commanders eventually figured out that the no-surrender problem was, in part, a language problem, and fixing it produced measurable results. The standard Japanese words for surrender, kozen and kafuku, carried an unbearable weight of shame within the culture the Senjinkan had built. Interrogations conducted by the Allied translator and interpreter section confirmed that even the English phrase "I surrender," printed on early safe conduct leaflets, was itself offensive enough to discourage Japanese soldiers from using it. The Office of War Information and the Psychological Warfare Branch responded by changing the wording on their standard safe conduct passes to a phrase stripped of that connotation entirely: "I cease resistance." The Allied translator and interpreter section, the unit responsible for this work, drew heavily on Japanese-American linguists and defector-informed interrogation to refine its materials over the course of the war, treating leaflet language less like a one-time propaganda product and more like a system to be continuously tested and revised against real battlefield feedback. Australia ran a parallel effort through its own Far Eastern Liaison Office, coordinating with the American Office of War Information and Psychological Warfare Branch across the Southwest Pacific Theater. It's an unusual thing to say about a wartime psychological operation, but this was functionally a controlled test of message framing against a captive audience of millions, run under the highest possible stakes. The first documented leaflet-driven surrenders came out of Guadalcanal. Operations in Dutch New Guinea produced several hundred more. On Okinawa alone, American forces printed and dropped more than 6 million leaflets, and roughly 11,000 Japanese personnel surrendered during that campaign, the same figure discussed earlier as the dramatic outlier in the battle statistics. Historian Alison Gilmore's research argues that psychological warfare meaningfully increased Japanese surrender rates, not as a minor side effect, but as a real and measurable operational success. By the war's final months, the Allies had dropped roughly 2 billion leaflets over Japanese-held territory and the home islands combined, a volume large enough that, statistically, the average Japanese soldier or civilian in the war's last year encountered Allied surrender messaging repeatedly, whether or not any single leaflet ever changed a single mind on its own. None of this erases the ideology or the discipline that made surrender so rare in the first place. What it shows is that the no-surrender behavior was never a fixed, unchangeable fact about Japanese soldiers as people. It was a behavior that responded, measurably, to changes in framing, circumstance, and expected treatment. Exactly what should happen if structural and situational pressures were doing real work alongside ideology, rather than simply riding along beside it doing nothing. On Act 2, in the final days of the battle that opened this story, an American-trained Japanese physician named Dr. Paul Nobuo Tatsuguchi kept a diary that was later recovered by American forces. His final entries, dated May 28 of 1943, described the field hospital's last hours before the garrison's final charge, the order that the last assault would go forward, and that all the patients in the hospital were to be killed rather than left alive, with Tatsuguchi himself describing taking care of all the patients with grenades. A trained doctor, a man whose entire profession existed to preserve life, ended his war killing patients who couldn't fight and couldn't flee, because the system both men served had made that outcome more acceptable than the alternative of leaving them to be captured. This is what the abstract statistics from Act 2, 2,351 buried, 28 taken prisoner, actually meant on the ground, inside a single tent, on a single night. The ideology traced here from a book written in 1899 for Western readers to a military order signed in 1941 reached, by 1943, into a field hospital and put a grenade in a doctor's hand. Tatsuguchi's diary survived only because American soldiers recovered it from his body, and it was later translated and circulated, which means the words themselves were never meant for anyone outside his own command. There's no propaganda function in that diary entry, no audience being performed for. It's simply a record of what one man did, and what he believed he had to do. In the final hours of a battle whose statistical outcome, 28 prisoners out of nearly 3,000 men, this story opened with. The distance between that opening statistic and this diary entry is the entire argument here, compressed into a single measurable gap. The difference between a number on a page and the specific, individual decision that number represents, repeated thousands of times across 6 years of war. Japan's surrender was announced in the Emperor's own radio broadcast on August 15th of 1945 and formalized aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd. For most soldiers, the war ended there. For a documented group of more than 120 stragglers scattered across the Pacific, it didn't. Captain Sake Oba held out on Saipan for 512 days after the island fell, only surrendering on December 1st of 1945, and only after a former Japanese general personally delivered authenticated orders proving the war had truly ended. He was treated with genuine respect by the American Marine officers who received his surrender, and his sword was returned to his family decades later by one of them. Lieutenant E.I. Yamaguchi surrendered on Poliliu in April of 1947, nearly 2 years after the war's end. 2 more soldiers, Yamakichi Kafuku and Matsuda Lansoki, held out on Iwo Jima until January of 1949, roughly 4 years after the battle that had already claimed most of their garrison. And Teruo Nakamura, the Taiwanese Aboriginal soldier whose unequal post-war treatment came up earlier, held out until December of 1974, 3 decades after Japan itself had surrendered. Researchers who have tracked this phenomenon put the total number of documented post-war stragglers recovered across the Pacific from 1947 through 1974 at more than 120 individuals, a population large enough that it can't be dismissed as a handful of isolated anomalies. Each of them had absorbed the same core lesson the Senjinkan had spent years drilling into the entire Imperial Army, that in order to resist, once given, remained valid until countermanded by a source the soldier personally trusted, and that surrendering without that authorization wasn't an act of survival, but an act of betrayal. For most of these men, ending the war required something almost as elaborate as starting it had: a former commanding officer, a family member, or an authenticated written order, physically delivered, before the soldier could accept that laying down his weapon was now the loyal choice rather than the disloyal one. Bushido didn't disappear from Japanese public life after 1945. Its wartime, militarist form was rejected, but the idea got quietly reinvented once again, this time drifting back closer to Naito's original, less martial version. By the 1980s, a popular revival had settled around that softer reading, even as more nationalist interpretations continued to circulate in some conservative political circles. Somewhere in between, the idea got recruited into an entirely different story. By the 1970s, commentators were reaching for Bushido to explain Japan's post-war economic rise, framing corporate loyalty and salaryman work culture as a modern descendant of samurai discipline, a claim contemporary historians treat with real skepticism, since it's structurally the exact same move Naito made in 1899, taking something invented and presenting it as ancient. The trope proved durable enough to resurface decades later in coverage of entirely unrelated events, including workers involved in the cleanup following the 2011 Fukushima nuclear accident, whose discipline under extreme conditions got framed, in some accounts, through that same borrowed vocabulary of an ancient warrior code, a sign of just how flexible and how detached from its actual origins the modern idea of Bushido had become, more than a century after Naito first assembled it. For an audience that had never set foot in Japan, The most visible post-war act still directly associated with Bushido in the public imagination isn't military at all. In 1970, the novelist Mishima Yukio committed ritual suicide after a failed attempt to incite a coup, framing his death explicitly in the language of the old warrior code. A reminder that the ideology traced through this entire story didn't end with the war, but kept resurfacing in Japanese public life for decades afterward, detached from any battlefield at all. The ideology's most painful modern echo, though, didn't surface in a novelist's final act. It surfaced in a decision by Japan's own Ministry of Education. In 2007, the ministry ordered textbook publishers to soften language describing the imperial military's coercive role in the mass suicides of Okinawan civilians during the 1945 battle, the same civilian deaths, numbering in the tens of thousands, referenced earlier here. Roughly 110,000 Okinawans took to the streets in protest that September. The argument over how directly the military coerced those civilian deaths is, in miniature, the same argument this entire story has been walking through: how much of what happened was imposed from above, and how much was something else. Scholarship on this subject has continued well into the present decade. Benish's 2014 study remains the reference point every subsequent historian responds to. Tanaka released a second edition of Hidden Horrors in 2018 with a foreword from Dower himself. Kawano's structural research was published as recently as 2017, and archaeological survey work on Attu, conducted by the National Park Service and NOAA as recently as 2024, continues to recover and identify remains from the battle that opened this story more than 80 years after the fighting ended. A reminder that the historical record on this subject is still, in a very literal sense, being unearthed. A garrison of nearly 3,000 men on a frozen island produced 28 prisoners. A garrison of comparable size on Okinawa, 2 years later, produced over 11,000. Both groups of men had read, or been read, the same order. Both served the same emperor, under the same official doctrine that treated capture as a crime worse than death. The difference between those two outcomes wasn't written in the Senjinkan. It was written in who those men were, what unit held them together, how long the state had spent shaping them, and what they genuinely believed would happen to them the moment they raised their hands. So the question worth sitting with, in the end, is the same one the historians behind this story still argue about today. When a soldier chooses to die rather than surrender, how much of that choice is really his own, and how much of it was decided for him, years earlier, by people he never met, writing a document he could never fully escape? Consider the full chain one more time, start to finish. A Quaker-raised diplomat writes a book for American and European readers in 1899, borrowing the language of European chivalry to describe a Japanese warrior tradition that, according to the historians who have studied it most closely, never existed in the unified form he described. For decades later, a war ministry takes that borrowed, partly invented tradition and writes it into military law, backed by criminal penalties for the men who fail to live up to it. Millions of soldiers get raised inside a school system and a conscription pipeline built around that law, some of them ethnically Japanese and fully absorbed into its promise of national honor, others colonial subjects conscripted into an identity that was never fully offered to them in the first place. Then a war begins, and the men shaped by that law meet an enemy shaped by its own dehumanizing assumptions about them. And the two systems reinforce each other for 4 years, on islands most of the men fighting on them had never heard of before 1943. 28 prisoners came out of Attu, and 11,000 came out of Okinawa. A diary sat in a field hospital, and decades later, a garden got planted on the site of a mass breakout that ended in over 200 deaths. A Taiwanese soldier was still holding his post in 1974, valued at $227 by the nation he had never stopped serving. None of it was inevitable, and none of it was simply cultural. It was built, piece by piece, by identifiable people at identifiable moments, which means it could have been built differently. And the fact that it wasn't is the actual history this story has tried to lay out plainly, without resolving it into something simpler than it was.